Arms just out to the sides. We're going to do a couple of moments here of cat and cow at the pelvic lumbar region. So the first couple, it's sort of like wakey, wakey. How's the low back feeling today? And then as you go through a few more, begin to refine. So you're moving the middle of your body. There's no way that that is isolated from anything in the whole entirety of the universe. But what I'd like you to get a sense of is that you're not employing your neck or your ribs in order to mobilize in the spine around the pelvic lumbar area. And the next couple times that you get into one end and then the other of the movement, pause for a moment. So I'm tucking my tailbone here, and I want to amplify that work. So there's the range of motion that it's just like tuck your tailbone. Okay, no big deal. I want to slip past that and begin to open up that range of motion through concerted effort. So as I have my tailbone tucked in, I mean, if you were watching me, you wouldn't see anything interesting. But I am working here to press the lumbar even more deeply into the floor, and like the very base of my butt has lifted off of the mat, but I'm not trying to push off of the floor. As I hold on to this very steep, intentional, muscled up tailbone tuck for a few moments, I want to make sure that I'm not doing the silly bits that I might end up doing, like shrugging my shoulders, lifting or lowering my chin, holding my breath. All right, and then I'm going to flip it to the other direction. So I'm going to work here to press the bottom edge of my sacrum around the tailbone into the floor. And my inclination, I'm sure many people here would be like to just hoist the ribs off the floor by pressing the shoulders down. But again, think about this being really intentional around the pelvic and lumbar region, but your ribs are sort of like, well, I'm not going to follow their lead. So very gently, I'm going to try to drop my ribs to the floor and press my tailbone into the floor. So I've got an exaggerated lumbar curve here. Again, it's not much to see, but as I hold on to that, I'm just going to kind of like really lean against that. Could I press that edge of the sacrum more firmly to the floor? And then one or two more of those lifting and lowering of the tailbones, just checking in with mobility here. All right, so this is going to be a little, it's going to be our like speed lesson on squatting. So from keeping the pelvis kind of neutral, though we won't be obsessive about it, I'd like you to take your right knee to your chest, use your hands over the shin or the back of the thigh, or even employ a strap. And then lift that left leg straight up and then lower it out as you bring it down. So as you bring the left leg to the floor extended, there's been this action of like it trying to charge out away from the hip. And then once it's on the ground, it's rested there, but it's not asleep. Roll your shoulders back and down, bend your elbows deeper, meaning use your biceps and your upper arms to passively increase the amount of hip flexion you have here. Everyone's hip sockets do operate a little differently, and you might have contours and edges and shapes that I wouldn't personally account for. So there's space here to aim that knee more to the side rather than just straight towards your jaw. But look for a space where you can say, I think that's just about the end of the road for hip flexion. All right, let's draw that left knee in, switch the hands over to that left knee, right leg goes up. And as you lower it down, there's this sort of like charging out, lengthening out, like someone's tugging your leg as you lower it down. And then once it's against the floor, again, it can stay there, it's supported, but it's not snoozing. We'll bend into the elbows any amount more deeply and pull down, actively use your arms here to snug that thigh bone closer. And again, what little angle change would you make just to get a sense that you've really kind of completed, like that's about all the hip flexion you get, unless, you know, maybe you'd be able to squeak out another degree or two if someone stood above you and applied their body weight, but you're probably pretty close to the end of it. That's passive range of motion, meaning your arms aren't passive, they are charged up, but they are employing their strength in the service of trying to figure out how deeply we can take that thigh towards the chest or just to the side. All right, right knee comes back in. You're going to once more switch your hands over. Left leg goes up, it goes out, and it goes down. As it touches the floor, it's still kind of charging out. And then one more time, you're going to roll your shoulders back and down, bend the elbows. Here it is, bicep strength, upper arm strength. Your elbows are improving your hip flexion. But then what's life like without that? So go ahead and slip your hands off. Just take your arms to the side, like a mimicking of Shavasana. You're probably more charged up than that. And as you have this hands-free version, can you take that right thigh any deeper in? Did you lose a couple of degrees? I sure did. When I took my hands off, my leg bounced away, not by miles, but enough to have noticed. And as you work here to bring that thigh in closer, can you bring the back of the left thigh closer to the floor? Yeah, left leg super straight. So it's like you're taking this, like you're out in the woods, taking a bit of a hike and you're encountering a really tall step up, scrambling up a little boulder here. Right, no hands for the moment, and call back that left leg. Switch your hands to hold on to that left leg, right leg up, out, and down. And as it comes down, again, it's not snoozing. Think here about the back of the thigh coming close to the floor on that right leg, and then elbows go for it. They bend, your biceps charge up the pose. They bring that thigh in any amount closer. And once you get to that edge of like, here it is, I'm pretty close to full range of motion of hip flexion. From there, subtract your hands. This is gonna be a tougher side for me. You can hear it in my voice, grunting. And as I let my arms go, I'm gonna try to tell my shoulders, like, be intentional, like don't betray the stress in the posture, like shoulders to the ground. And as I pull in on that left leg, I'm noticing a difference in the range of motion, meaning I popped out further when my hands came off. And then now that I'm trying to pull my thigh in closer without the use of my hands, it's harder. This is no surprise to me. This tends to be the side where if I'm twisting off of this strength or I'm balancing off of this strength, it's a little less dependable. Well, give it another couple of breaths. And again, you might feel like, man, it doesn't really come in at all. That's all right, you're working on it. And that leg on the floor is sort of, it's like your barometer here on how much you're using your pelvis to flex your hip. So if that thigh is floating off the floor, bring it down. Last breath or so. All right, then we're gonna bring that right knee back in. Use two hands, one on each leg, and tuck into this cannonball position, meaning when I pull my knees into my chest here, it's twofold. One is that, yeah, I did some hip flexion because my arms are helping me out, but I also tucked my tailbone towards the ceiling. Never in my life will you see me jump off of something in a cannonball position, by the way. It's just something I've seen in the world. I'm not a daredevil. I don't jump into water. Too much of a chicken. All right, so as you're here for the moment, you've kind of doubled up the motions. I mean, it's really more complex than that, but those are the two that are big. So when you let go, can you keep your knees towards your chest? And again, feel free to point them as far to the side as it makes it reasonable for you. And you're tucking your tailbone. You're really trying to scoop your backside off the floor by any amount. So I feel here that I'm really pushing down into the ground with, like, I don't know, lumbar vertebra 2 or 3, who could say for sure? And we'll give that a breath or so. All right, and then let's go ahead and bring the feet to the floor, sort of priming up all those actions while we're not weight bearing on top of them. Let's turn to the side and we'll come here into a quadruped position. And as you set yourself up to quadruped, toes are turned under. And swing a glance over each shoulder and see how that is on your feet. You know, some people just have funny little toes, but if you have the ability to get like 4 or even all 5 of your toes on each foot to actually tuck against the floor, you go for it, even if it requires, like I'm doing, like a little manual assistance, so that you can get a sense here that more and more you're opening underneath the soles of the toes. And as you have those toes turned under, hands pressed down, and we'll move the shoulders back. And I want you to think here about lifting your tailbone up, and think of it as that motion we were doing earlier on the ground, which was, you could tip your tailbone up and like lift your chin and put your ribs on the ground, but we're going to do that tailbone lifting up bit that doesn't really require the rest of the spine to follow suit. So as much as I'm trying to kick tailbone towards the ceiling, I'm also trying to lift my ribs away from the floor. And it's sort of like this kinetic energy, like I could use it more, I could back off. It's kind of like hovering in the middle usage. But that's what we're going to use for like a little enlightenment here for the pelvic position. I'd like you to sit back without thinking about child's pose. So you're not going to sit down necessarily, you're just going to kind of squeak your hips back. And then once you've moved your hips back, walk your hands forward. Again, I could sit lower, but I'm not going to give in to the gravity of this. And I am going to keep thinking about my tailbone lifting up. Then once my hands have walked forward, I have a little bit of weight on my hands, plenty on my knees and toes, but I feel pretty determined effort here on the sides and the backs of my hips to keep my tailbone lifting up. And then with that, raise one hand off of the floor, reach out ahead of you. Release it down. Do the other side, the other hand lifts up, reaches out ahead of you. And then you're putting it down. The tailbone lifting up, we'll do that a couple more times. Tailbone lifting up is a big deal here. So if you found a way to kind of tuck under or to sneak into a child's pose, it is not that. It's sort of like in a moment's notice, you could come right up into a super tall downward dog. All right, and then once you've gone back and forth a couple times, one hand then the other, how would it go to lift your palms from the floor and just be on fingertips? And then how would it go to lift both hands at once? Yep. The hands slap the floor pretty quickly after that. So I'm gonna try again. 1, 2, 3. But I'm trying to load my hips so that's what's gonna hold me up. And it's a little bit of a kind of a silly exercise because I know we can't really sustain it, sort of like the bucking bronco. All right, let's go ahead and come back to a typical quadruped position here. Just a couple of times, we're gonna dip down the chest, come back up in a few rhomboid push-ups. We won't be on the hands too much here, but I can't resist. We gotta do a little something for those shoulders before we change position. All right, keeping the toes turned under, let's go ahead and sit back. And I know some people are pretty content to sit on their heels. That's not me. So I'm going to lift my knees up. Bring my knees to the support. If you can bring your knees to the ground with your toes turned under, you're doing great. Does not work for my feet these days. It will once it thaws out a little bit more. They still have winter toes. Yeah, boot weather. I know, I'm still like clumping around. Had spikes on my boots the other day, so these toes are frozen still. All right, a couple of breaths here. And of course, the alternate to being upright, if that's just too much pressure, is to come forward. You can come forward with your knees on the ground. There are lots of different ways to play this. It has to be tolerable. What's the point of torturing those little bones and joints? All right, from that, we'll move knee supports if you employed them. Knees back down to the floor. And let's see about, even if it's hand assisted, can you take your knees off the floor, and your heels don't have to come down because I know they can't for everyone, but could you try that a couple of times from knees being down? And you could still use knee support. I said not to, but that doesn't really matter. And then could you roll over so that you're more towards a squat? Yeah, and again, hand assisted is totally fine. You know me, I'm always trying to prove my proficiency in squatting, so I'm not using them, but I could. And even if your heels don't touch down, you're just kind of rolling over your feet in this way. Okay, but one way or another, next time you're in a squat or semi-squat, let's just come up to standing. There we are. And then let's do a brief calf stretch. So you can roll a blanket. Here, Erica, I'll launch you one of these. Watch, I'm following protocol. Hand sanitizer. Keeping social distance. Throwing props. right, so just a folded or rolled blanket is just as sufficient, but we got these in the studio, so we'll use them. So right foot, inner edge of lift, whatever you're going to select to use. We'll give this a couple of breaths. You're going to think about how impacted does mountain pose, like a Tadasana or Samasthiti, is how impacted is that by having one foot in dorsiflexion? For some people, it's like an earthquake. And other people, it's just a little tremor. Version 1, feet are side by side. Version 2, left foot can take a slight step ahead. Version 3, you could also bend the left knee, and you can do these as a cycle, right? Like one static stretch forever with no change to it. That doesn't necessarily create the most growth in your body. It's useful, it's super educational, like that's what it feels like. But you could try a couple of these on for size. You could try stepping the left foot further out. And wherever you charge with your calf stretch, just keeping a sense here that you can attest that your body is facing forward. There's no swivel to the right. There's no shift to the left or right. And then let's come back off of that. Go back to version 1, which is feet side by side. And then by any amount, including like barely any at all, can you bend your right knee? That's the knee of the foot that's standing on the dome. And this one's a hard one not to shift with, but see about at least facing forward, even if this does make your pelvic area do that lifting action. Because you're sinking down on one side, it would be funny to imagine that you could not move your pelvis with that. All right, let's go ahead and straighten off that right knee. Briefly, bring your right foot behind you and come onto the top of the foot. So kind of a lightning round of calf, calf and ankle stuff here. And this one you can play with by like where you step the top of that foot. So if I bring it more alongside, my knee pokes forward. And this feels more like I'm grinding the knuckle of my big toe into the floor. I'm less on the top of my foot. And it affects it has a different feel. And if I bring it further back, it's more like, oh yeah, more of the top of my foot is on the floor. Either way, I seem to get some stretch up the front of my shin. Right, we'll come out of that and let's do those few things on the left. So support, lift, comes underneath that left foot. The first edge of it for many people would be just feet being in line. The second edge of that would be to have that right foot step forward as though you're taking a little walk up your yoga mat. And then the third place you could put that is with a bit of a knee bend and that free right leg, the one that's walking around. And you can always expand the length of your stride here. A few breaths. And wherever you set this with the intention that I'm going to expose the back of my calf to a fair amount of length, probably one it doesn't encounter unless you're really thinking of it or walking up a steep hill or you're doing those long hikes with changes in terrain. You just want to make sure that that does not become such an influence that suddenly you're not standing facing forward. Like what sort of shifting actions, what sort of twisting actions. We try to catch those. All right, let's go ahead and step hop back. And then as you come back to that first position with the feet in line with one another, how much, if any, can you bend your left knee? Not a ton. The trick side, yeah. Think about a little arch lift. I know you're in like a very narrow corridor with what can happen in that ankle, but think about that arch lifting off of the dome any amount. Yeah, yeah, not bad. Mm, how does it feel? Like stuck? Yeah, yeah, like no go. Okay, let's go ahead and straighten off that ankle. It's such a for some people it's just such a small space to move, and then if there's ankle history, it can be really difficult. All right, so last little check-in here is to come on to the top of the foot. And again, there is not one set position that I'll teach this morning. You could try on for size a few different places. Again, when I bring it forward, I do feel this kind of comes over that like toe knuckle area a little bit more. If I go back, it's a little bit more dispersed. Yeah. Oh, good. That's awesome. Yeah. You know, when there's limitation in that dorsiflexion, it's like the front of the shin, if this is the lower leg, this is the top of the foot, that front of the shin has to work so hard to pick up the toes. And so that's what we're stretching right now, that like tibialis anterior stuff. It's a good one to have in your back pocket. All right, let's come off from there. And I would like us to, trying to think of what props I was going to reasonably ask you to use. Well, let's grab a block, or actually, I think what's useful for most people is to create like a little double block scenario. So I'm putting these side by side on their flat side. I'll go from the side so you can see. You're going to have your feet up on this, but you're going to leave your heels off. So when you come onto this little platform, they don't have to share a block. And the first part of it is just sort of getting into it. And everybody who has a really healthy nervous system, which is most people in most yoga, you can quickly sort out the way to make this not so very perilous for you. So when you come into it, what I end up doing is this: I put my pelvis forward, my shoulders back, and my heels are, they're not so much higher than the block, but this just kind of puts a lot of compression into the low back and my hips and the tops of my hamstrings, which is no big deal. Like the word compression isn't bad there. That's just kind of where I put the weight of my body to stay without falling off the block. So what is your tendency? Some people will put their hands forward or out and kind of use their upper limbs to surf the imbalance. So how much of a Tadasana can you put into this, with the idea that probably it's not going to be 100%. And I have I've got long feet, so I've got options. But I'd say the first third of my foot is on the block and the back 2/3 is hanging off. And if I wanted to make my life easier, I would walk forward on the block and just leave my heels hanging off. And that's like, oh, I can really actually change that quite a bit. So walk it around a little bit, walk the plank a little bit here, try coming forward, try coming back. I'm going to leave us here for a moment before I give us a determined exercise. So just experiment with it and to see what's involved. I'm thinking of ankles. I'm thinking of arches that could lift. So when you're doing this, if your go-to is to internally rotate to turn the thighs in, could you be here discovering your balance with those arches lifting, even though it's hard to gauge that with half the arch or 2/3 of the arch not on the block. But again, you could try to make it like really easy peasy for a moment and walk forward. So just barely your heels are hanging off. Figure that one out. And then you could be more experimental and leave like just the balls of the feet on the block. And of course, to prevent the block from flipping you off, you have to distort your posture, which is fine. We just want to know it. We just want to see it, feel it, do it. All right, and then find a place where you're contending with some balance, but you're not forced into the most distorted position ever. And you can at least kind of attend to those corrections, even if they last for just a split second. So again, I know I'm going to be pitching forward by quite a bit, but there's a way that I can kind of say, oh, not that much, Erin, back it up just a little. And then I want you to think here about coming up into a calf raise. So you're going to lift your heels as high as you can. And for me, that's going to improve my balance by quite a bit because I don't have to figure out what it means to have my hips hanging off of a block, so to speak, because it brings my body forward, right? And then so slowly, like taking up hours and days and weeks, you're going to begin to lower your heels. And it's a tough one because I don't want you to smash your arches totally flat, but it's hard not to. Keep the arches lifted, and can you even lower your heels just below the block? And that's when you'll see me like really moving my hips forward so that I don't fall backwards. But I'm gonna try to catch and change the amount of it that I can. I cannot change 100% of it, maybe like 13%. And let's do a few of those slow lowering actions. So you're going to go up onto the highest heels you've got. When you get up there, can you balance your ankles, or do they bow apart, like bow-legged at the ankles, or do they knock in like knock ankles? And try to balance across the whole flat of the ball of the foot. No, I don't want to hit the ground. All right. And then once you're up and standing tippy-toed for that moment, let's here begin to slowly lower yourself down. Burning, my ankles are burning. Until your heels are maybe just a smidgen lower than the blocks. Nice, nice, Erica. She looks so much more balanced than I do. I wish the camera was pointing at her. Let's do this one more time. So I'm starting low. It's like my feet are hanging off the block. It definitely puts my pelvis forward. I'm gonna stay there for a moment and say, yes, we get it, Erin, but could you move your hips back any amount? Oh, a little bit. And then we'll come all the way back up. Highest heels you can put on here. Full contraction on the back of the calves. And then slowly with control, this one's already going better than my second one, I'm proud. I'm gonna begin to lower all the way on down, like those heels would be lower than your blocks. And can you stay there for a moment? Oh, yeah, I know that was mutual. We both went like this at the same time. All right, let's step off from there. Oof, let's set that aside. And we have available to us in the studio these Theraband loops. If you have it at home, fantastic. If not, don't worry about it too much. But I like the way that this sort of says to your legs, get thinking. So let's slide this up around thighs or shins. It does work out differently for different bodies, so whatever works well. And you're just going to take your feet out to an Utkatasana, because we're involving this strap, this band rather. You might feel like you're setting your legs just a little bit wider than usual or more narrow, just kind of depends on your body. And so when you come into this, you just want some tension loaded. And if you don't have a loop, then you'll do fine without it. You'll have your feet at pelvic width distance. And we're going to do a couple of Utkatasana type of squats, right? That's what we call that pose in the yoga universe. What I'd like you to do is to take your hands just to prayer and get a sense here that you're going to simultaneously bend your knees and your hips. So it happens like it's a twofer, like it's not one then the other, though I've seen people kind of like do like a half Uttanasana and then they put a knee bend in, but really just try to not think about it really, because if the more you try to organize it, we get too much yoga in the brain and we don't actually move. And as you come into your Utkatasana, a version of squatting, you're going to keep that energy pressing out on your loop. You don't have to splay your knees way further apart. You just want to keep it loaded with that sense of push out. And as you're here, think about any increase of knee flexion, hip flexion, like it's simultaneous, knee flexion, hip flexion. And that might here begin to have your knees pitch forward of your toes. How much can you move your shins back without straightening your legs, right? So there's this really narrow space in which we're trying to conceive of this positioning. And As everyone knows, it does it does matter on the length of your bones and the way they are proportioned to each other. So as you bend your knees and your hips, can you think about sitting back? All right, let's come all the way back up and just take a breath. We're gonna do that twice more. And so I always think of it as like when you're playing like ping pong, not ping pong, pinball, and that ball just keeps on like bouncing off every really firm like boundary around it, and it just tries to find its way. And that's kind of what we're doing here, sort of, but not really. You're going to bring your hands to prayer, come back down, and as you sit into this, it's not that every instruction can get completed to the utmost. If I bend my knees and hips deeper, which I'm happy to do, I end up with my knees coming very far forward. And when I try to move my shins back, the backs of my knees open up. And that's not uncommon. So I then one more time try to sit lower, and I just keep on bouncing from one parameter to the other. But that means I'm constantly in motion. So I'll take it. And there's a press out energy with the legs. And let's come all the way back up. Looks good. Take a breath. We'll do it a third and final time. And again, you might just keep on bouncing, like she said, hips deeper, she said knees deeper, she said shins back, and it's all of that. This next time we come into it, I want you to make double sure that you don't approach this with the tailbone turning under, that you feel like that tailbone is flicking up behind you, like you've got your proud peacock feathers back there and you want everyone to see them. So as you sit on down and you move your shins on back, can you use that to lift your tailbone? I'd like you to think about this being a back bend, even if in another scenario or circumstance it's not taught that way. Go ahead and invite that ability here to lift the tailbone up. I don't know, it just kind of makes it easier, actually. Let's inhale, exhale, come up to standing. Oh, quads, fatigue. And then from this, we won't be so determined with our, alignment thinking mind. We're just going to do a few like fitness style squats. So go ahead and walk your feet out wider. Keep some tension loaded on this and turn your feet out. Which, don't you know, is not poisonous to the human body. Ask a yogi. They'll be like, no, your feet must point forward. Not reasonable. All right, hands come to prayer, or you could cap a fist. And we'll just go through a few somewhat slowly just to kind of catch this, especially if through yoga training, you don't end up with your feet turned out. Often it can feel a little sacrilegious, but when you go over this, you just have your knees still kind of pointing over your toes or thereabouts. If the width of the pose, the turnout of the legs combined with your banding just makes it feel like it's not correct, keep editing until you feel like, oh, I can drop the knees into a bend, stick my butt out and lower down and come back up. We'll just do a few more. I'm not counting. They still count, but I'm not counting them. And as you come up and down on the last couple, can you really press out on that band from start to finish? Really press out. So when I bend my knees, it's like, oh yeah, I know how to do that now because they're getting wider apart. But can I keep pressing out even when my legs come to straighten? All right, let's take a pause the next time we're up. And again, feel free to edit. And on this next one, I'd like you to add, this is just a variable change. It's not anything crazy. I just want you to hold something, and I'm just going to go for a bolster because I've got a couple right there. And it could be something small. It could be a weight. It could be blankets. It could be a block. It could be if you're at home, you could do whatever you've got. I got to move my bolster away as I set my feet. And this isn't, we're not going to lift it overhead. We're not going to do anything different. I just want our hands to have to contend with a different variable. And same squat. So feet are apart, wider than hips with distance, toes turn out. Those two actions pair with each other differently in everyone's body. What's the one that doesn't feel like it's treacherous for your knees? Which one that you feel like you can actually bend and straighten your legs? And then down we go, and then back up. And you can keep your object close to your chest. You could try having a little bit further out. You could hold it over to one side. You could have it at center. You could move over to the other side. If you wanted to, you could have it overhead. You don't have to lift it the whole time. But you're just changing something here, because the big difference between this squat and then a million Utkatasanas in your yoga practice is that this one's moving and changing. What about one-handed? What about the other hand? What about your eyes closed? All right, just kind of doing like your contemporary dance routine in your upper body, and then your lower body is just doing some squats. All right, and then the next time you're up, you can set that object down, and we'll move that out of the way. Okay, so last trick for our last few minutes here, you can take the band off, and what I'd like you to come up with is a low platform so that you can sit on it in a squat. In yoga, we'd call it Malasana. So I'm gonna go with a couple of blankets. A couple of blocks would be great. Blocks plus blankets also good. And I'm just gonna sit sideways such that you can see what I'm doing. And you can go higher or lower for my folks at home. You can even do this from a chair. You can even stack blankets and blocks. So plenty of stuff that can get used here. And I just want you to come to the very front edge of this with your toes either pointing forward, or if you want to set your legs wider apart, you might also turn your toes out. And you know those instructions in a yoga class, like turn your back foot in 45 degrees, that's all very general. So when I say turn your feet out with this, it's not like you're, prima ballerina who can like turn their feet out 90 degrees, unless you are, but you might just have your feet turn out a little bit so that there's no internal rotation on the shin when you might be externally rotating and abducting on the thigh. And then when you come into this, what would help you sit up taller? So I'll put my hands behind me. I'll kind of lift my butt a couple times to sort of like stretch up from my low back. Once I've got that, I'd hang on to my shins and use that to help my upper back. And then when you're hanging onto your shins a couple of times here, I want you to do that tailbone under, tailbone lifting that we did at the very start of class. And my inclination is like throw my shoulders and my face, my upper chest into this, but I'm going to try to keep upper body pretty still and just move my lower body. Yeah, looks good. We'll do a few. And then I want you to end on the note of which you are singing the tune of lifting the tailbone. So as you have this, because there's so much flexion going on, dorsiflexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, your low back is like, yeah, me too, I'm gonna flex as well. But we make a squat functional by the ability to lift the low back. And again, squats are famous. You'll see people teaching them, pointing out other cultures, which is a very weird way to teach anything, that you can round your low back, and that's very true. But I want us to kind of look for the ability to say, I'm tipping my pelvis forward in the instance my thighs are coming in towards the pelvis. Because that, I think, for most people is where they don't have to like use momentum, like their arms and their torso rocking, that you can just come all the way on up. That's the plan, Stan. And if not, I'm not looking. You can put a hand on the ground or whatever gets you off. All right. And then when you're ready, can you get back down? And if it feels like, well, I didn't know she was going to have us coming up and down, then you could add another layer, because we're just going to mobilize it for the last couple of moments here. So not committing to that set position, but instead a position of mobility. And on the way up and down, imagine that, like, it's so complex. It's so complex. But could you, metaphorically lead yourself in and out of the posture with like the tailbone lifting up? Like, where can you put your consciousness? Sometimes my consciousness will go to my knees, like, oh gosh, they don't like this deep bend, and then they have to straighten with all my body weight on top of it. They're gonna get cranky. But I'm just gonna think about trying to use the strength of the back of my hips. And I added a layer. I'm gonna try subtracting it. Ooh, that was like falling down a cliff. That block was doing quite a bit. All right. And then we'll come all the way up, and then you can shake it off. All right, good morning. Thanks for being here for this.